Winter had settled heavily over the frontier town of Red Hollow. Snow clung to the rooftops like silent witnesses, and the wind carried the smell of pine and sawdust from the nearby forests where the lumber camps stood. Most people in town were gathered near the old courthouse square that afternoon. Though no one looked particularly proud to be there, the town council had announced a strange and troubling event, an auction meant to settle the debts of a mysterious traveler who had died the week before. Among the items listed was something that made many townsfolk uneasy. A young woman found traveling with him, her identity unknown, her face hidden beneath a rough burlap sack tied loosely around her head. Some whispered she might be a runaway. Others said she was a criminal. No one truly knew, but rumors spread faster than the winter wind. Standing quietly at the back of the crowd was Thomas Hale, a lonely lumberjack who rarely came into town unless he needed supplies. His broad shoulders and worn coat told the story of years spent alone among towering trees. Thomas didn't care much for gossip or crowds, yet something about the uneasy silence of the auction pulled him there. That day the auctioneer cleared his throat loudly, stamping his boots against the wooden platform to shake off the cold. Around him, crates of belongings were quickly sold, old tools, a horse saddle, a broken lantern. The crowd murmured and placed small bids, eager to finish the unpleasant business and return home before the storm clouds thickened. Finally, the last item remained. Two guards led forward, a slender figure wrapped in a grey shawl. The sack over her head hid every trace of her identity. Even her hands trembled as she stood before the crowd. A nervous whisper rippled through the square. Some men laughed uncomfortably. Others looked away. The auctioneer raised his hand and spoke with forced cheer. Last item of the day. A servant contract. Healthy, capable worker. Starting bid $5. Silence answered him. No one moved. No one wanted the responsibility or the strange mystery that came with her. The auctioneer tried again, lowering the price. $3. Still nothing. The woman stood perfectly still, like a statue made of fear and exhaustion. Thomas shifted where he stood. Something about the scene unsettled him deeply. It reminded him too much of the loneliness he knew so well. After several awkward moments, the auctioneer sighed and rubbed his forehead. Fine, then. $2, he muttered, clearly embarrassed. A few men chuckled from the crowd, whispering cruel jokes. Thomas looked at the woman again. Even through the sack, he could sense something in her posture, not weakness, but quiet dignity, like someone who had endured more than anyone could see. Without thinking too much about it, Thomas raised his hand. $2. The words left his mouth before his mind fully caught up. The square fell silent as everyone turned toward the tall lumberjack at the back. The auctioneer blinked in surprise. $2 from Mr. Hale. Going once, going twice. The gavel struck the wood with a sharp crack. Sold. Just like that, the strange auction ended. Thomas stepped forward slowly, handing over 2 worn coins. As the guards released the woman, she lifted her head slightly toward him. He could not see her face, yet he felt a strange pull in his chest, as if this moment, simple and quiet, would change both their lives forever. Thomas Hale led the quiet woman away from the courthouse square, while the murmuring townspeople slowly scattered. Behind them, snowflakes drifted lazily from the grey sky, settling on the brim of his worn hat as he walked toward the edge of town, where his old wagon was tied. Near the general store, the woman followed a step behind him, her movements careful and hesitant, as if every sound of the world made her unsure of where she stood. Thomas had bought her without asking a single question, and now that the moment had passed, he wondered if he had acted out of foolish impulse or simple human decency. He had spent most of his life alone in the pine forests cutting timber, speaking more to the wind and the trees than to other people. Loneliness had become so normal to him that he hardly noticed it anymore. Yet the sight of that frightened figure standing helplessly before a crowd had stirred something deep in him. When they reached the wagon, he placed the supplies he had bought earlier beside the seat and then turned toward her, unsure how to begin. The sack still covered her head, tied loosely at the neck. He cleared his throat gently and spoke in a calm voice that carried none of the harshness she might have expected from a stranger. "You can sit," he said quietly. "I ain't going to hurt you." For a moment she didn't move. Then slowly, cautiously, she climbed into the wagon. The road out of Red Hollow wound through a valley where tall pine trees formed a dark green wall against the winter sky. The wagon creaked softly as Thomas guided the horse along the frozen path. For nearly an hour they traveled in silence, the only sounds being the crunch of snow under the wheels and the distant call of a hawk. Somewhere above the trees, finally Thomas glanced sideways at the woman sitting beside him. "You don't have to keep that sack on your head," he said gently. "Nobody here to stare." She hesitated again, her hands gripping the edge of the seat. Slowly, she reached up and untied the rough rope around her neck. The sack slipped off, revealing a young woman whose face looked both exhausted and strangely strong. Her dark hair fell loosely around her shoulders, and faint bruises marked one side of her cheek, evidence of hardships she had not yet spoken about. Thomas quickly looked away, not wanting her to think he was staring. "Name's Thomas," he said simply. "Thomas Hale." For a long moment she said nothing. Then she whispered softly, almost like a secret she had carried too long. "My name is Elena." The name seemed to settle gently between them as the wagon continued deeper into the forest. Thomas felt oddly relieved to know it. A name meant she was no longer just a stranger bought at an auction. She was a real person with a past, a story, and perhaps hopes she had buried somewhere beneath fear. As the road climbed a hill, his small cabin finally came into view, a sturdy log house built beside a clearing where stacks of chopped timber stood neatly under a rough wooden shelter. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney, the last warmth he had left burning before leaving for town that morning. When the wagon stopped, Elena looked around cautiously, her eyes scanning the quiet forest as if she expected danger to appear from the shadows. Thomas stepped down first and offered his hand to help her. "This place ain't much," he admitted with a small smile, "but it's safe." She accepted his hand slowly. The moment her feet touched the ground, she looked toward the tall pine trees surrounding the cabin, then back at him. Something in her expression shifted, just slightly, like the first fragile hint of trust, beginning to grow. Days passed quietly in the small clearing where Thomas lived. Yet something about the rhythm of life that began to change almost immediately after Elena arrived. Thomas continued his work each morning before sunrise, heading into the forest with his axe while frost still clung to the ground like silver dust. Elena stayed behind at the cabin, at first moving cautiously through the small rooms as though afraid she might break something or anger the man who had brought her there. But Thomas never spoke harshly, never gave orders the way other men in town might have expected him to. Instead, he treated her as a guest who simply needed time. Slowly, she began helping around the cabin, sweeping the wooden floor, cooking simple meals over the iron stove, and repairing torn blankets with quiet determination. In the evenings, Thomas would sit by the fire sharpening his tools while she watched the flames dance inside the stone hearth. Neither of them spoke much, yet the silence between them no longer felt heavy. It felt peaceful, like two lonely souls learning to breathe the same air. Without fear, one night of fierce winter storm rolled through the mountains, rattling the cabin walls and sending snow swirling across the clearing like white ghosts. Thomas had returned early from the forest, sensing the storm long before the clouds had gathered. As the wind howled outside, he and Elena sat close to the fire while the cabin creaked under the force of the storm. For the first time since her arrival, Elena began to speak about her past. Her voice trembled at first, but gradually the story unfolded. She had been traveling with a man who promised work in the western towns, but the journey turned dark when he began treating her as property rather than a person. By the time they reached Red Hollow, she had already tried to escape twice. When he died suddenly of illness, the townspeople assumed she belonged among his possessions, and the auction had followed soon after. Thomas listened quietly, his jaw tightening with quiet anger at the cruelty of strangers who could treat a woman that way. When she finished, the storm outside had begun to fade. "You're free now," he said firmly. "No one here owns you." Elena stared at the firelight reflecting in Thomas's eyes, searching for any sign that he might change his mind someday. But she found none. Instead, she saw something rare, honesty that carried no hidden cost. For the first time in many months, she allowed herself to relax. The storm finally passed during the early hours of morning, leaving the forest buried beneath fresh snow that glowed softly under the rising sun. As Thomas stepped outside to begin clearing the path, Elena followed him into the cold air. She looked around at the peaceful wilderness stretching in every direction and realized something she had not felt in a long time. Safety. The realization startled her almost, as much as the kindness of the man beside. Her spring arrived slowly in the mountains, melting the heavy snow and filling the forest with the scent of fresh pine and damp earth. By then, Elena had become an inseparable part of life at the cabin. She learned how to stack timber, mend tools, and even guide the horse along the forest trails when Thomas needed help hauling logs. The townspeople of Red Hollow occasionally saw them together when Thomas visited the market, and whispers followed them through the dusty streets. Some mocked the lumberjack for buying a woman at auction. Others warned him she might bring trouble, but Thomas ignored them all. What mattered to him was the quiet laughter that had slowly begun to replace the fear in Elena's voice. For the first time in years, his cabin no longer felt empty. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and violet, Thomas and Elena sat on the wooden steps outside the cabin. The forest hummed with the sound of insects waking in the warm air. After a long silence, Elena spoke softly. "Why did you buy me that day?" she asked. Thomas scratched the back of his neck awkwardly. "Didn't feel right leaving you there," he admitted. "Besides, I figured $2 was a fair price to make sure nobody else decided your fate." She smiled faintly, but there was something deeper in her eyes. "You didn't just save me," she said quietly. "You gave me a life again." Thomas shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to respond. That was when she spoke the words that stunned him. "Thomas Hale," she said clearly, her voice stronger than he had ever heard it before. Hearing his full name from her lips sent a strange warmth through him. For months she had simply called him Thomas, yet the way she spoke his name now felt different, like a promise carried by the evening wind. She turned toward him fully and continued, "If I'm going to stay here, I don't want to stay as someone you bought. I want to stay as someone who chooses to be here." Thomas stared at her, understanding slowly dawning. His heart pounded harder than it ever had while facing falling trees in the forest. "Elena, are you saying—" She nodded gently. "I'm saying I'd marry you, if you'd have me." The small church in Red Hollow had rarely seen such a curious gathering as the morning Thomas Hale and Elena walked through its doors together. Word had spread quickly through town that the lonely lumberjack intended to marry the mysterious woman he had once purchased for $2. Some came out of pure curiosity. Others arrived expecting scandal or drama. But when the couple stood before the preacher, the room grew unexpectedly quiet. Thomas looked uncomfortable in his clean but simple coat, while Elena wore a modest dress sewn from fabric she had bought in town only days before. Yet there was something undeniable in the way they stood beside each other. Not ownership, not obligation, but partnership. When the preacher asked if anyone objected to the union, a tense silence filled the church. A few townspeople shifted in their seats, remembering the shameful auction that had started everything. No one spoke. Finally, the ceremony continued, and Thomas placed a simple silver ring on Elena's finger. His voice was steady as he repeated the vows. Elena's eyes shone with quiet emotion as she promised to stand beside him through whatever life brought. The moment they were declared husband and wife, the room seemed to breathe again. Outside the church, the spring sun shone brightly over Red Hollow. The same townspeople who had once watched Elena stand silently with a sack over her head now watched her walk proudly beside her husband. Thomas helped her into the wagon just as he had months before. But everything felt different now. As they rode away from town toward the pine forests, Elena looked back only once before turning forward again. The life she had once feared was gone. Ahead of her lay something far better, a future she had chosen herself. Beside the quiet lumberjack who had once spent $2 lonely and unknowingly changed both their lives forever.